Okay, so this is going to be the first video in a series of videos about Plato's Protagoras. Um, the Protagoras is what is sometimes called a transitional dialogue, meaning in that division of Plato's dialogues into early, middle, and late, the Protagoras appears somewhere in between middle and early. And what some scholars think, and I'm following them in this because it seems to be plausible, is that the transitional dialogues mark the point where Plato was going from simply presenting Socrates' views in sort of dramatically compelling dialogues, but fundamentally just expressing views of Socrates is that Plato himself, believed, to trying to present a worked out theory on the basis of these things that Socrates believes. So the idea is that Socrates believed this thing, and he believed that thing, and he believed one thing and another, but that Socrates had never sort of worked all his beliefs together into a unified theory. And so that at a certain point, Plato decided to do that. He decided to come up with a fully worked out theory that incorporated all the different things Socrates believed. But that in the process of doing so, he realized there were certain problems with the combination of things that Socrates believed. This comes out most especially in another transitional dialogue called the Meno, one of Plato's most famous dialogues, where it becomes clear that Plato's not become convinced, but has become worried that the way that Socrates goes about finding definitions of the key core ethical terms that he was interested in doesn't make any sense. But instead of saying, well, Socrates was just wrong, let's move on, what he does in the Meno is he tries to correct for the problem by adding doctrines that it's not at all clear the historical Socrates believed, because they don't really show up in any way in the early dialogues. And no one else who wrote about Socrates believed them. Now, in the Meno, that extra belief was the belief in reincarnation and the theory of recollection. And if you're interested in that, that's a dialogue that, well, I cover it in lots of classes. You can find a class where I cover that. Okay, so in the Protagoras, it's going to be hedonism that Plato decides Socrates needs to believe in order to make the rest of his views about virtue work. So the Meno is a dialogue about epistemology, about Socrates' views on knowledge and how you get it. The Protagoras is directly about what Socrates seemed most interested in, which was ethics, virtue. Plato's going to try to present a unified theory of the Socratic approach to virtue. And it's going to force him to argue for certain claims that we're going to see when we get to the Republic that Plato himself didn't actually believe. There's two key claims being made in this dialogue that Plato rejects. One of them is hedonism, and the other is the view that there's no such thing as incontinence or weakness of the will. We'll get to those in turn. They'll come in separate videos from this one. Like I said, this will be the first of a series of videos. Okay, so what are these views about virtue? Well, given what I had said earlier about the way that the early dialogues went, the Socratic dialogues went, you might be surprised to find out that Socrates even has views about virtue, because I believe I told you that Socrates usually ends up, or the Socratic dialogues, usually ends up with both Socrates and the person Socrates is talking to not coming up with a definition of the core terms. Right? So there are dialogues like the Euthyphro, which ends up with them not being able to define piety. And then there's dialogues where they talk about courage and they're not able to define courage. And they talk about friendship and they're not able to define friendship. And so that you might think, well, Socrates doesn't have any views, but he does have views. He has positions he returns to again and again in the early dialogues, and Plato's going to try to defend those in the Protagoras. In addition to being a dialogue where Plato tries to work out the implications of Socrates' views on ethics, the Protagoras is also one of Plato's most artful dialogues in terms of the writing. It's one of the most dramatic. There's, for example, more than one person he's talking to. Socrates starts out with a friend named Hippocrates, who they're walking to a guy named Callias's house. At Callias's house are a bunch of people. Most importantly, Protagoras, who's the person this dialogue is named after. Protagoras was a sophist. He was a traveling teacher. And the sophists had a weird position in Greek society. They were looked down upon by lots of people, but at the same time, their services were sought out by lots of people. And because of this, Plato has Socrates at the beginning of the dialogue express some worry about the fact that Hippocrates, his friend, wants to go talk to Protagoras. He's like, well, why? Why do you want to go talk to Protagoras? And Hippocrates can't quite explain it. Socrates just wants to know, like, well, what can Protagoras teach you? Like, what is he an expert in? It doesn't seem like he or any other sophists are experts in anything. This is actually a theme that Plato returns to a lot. Plato takes a very dim view of the sophists. It's one of the few things that's sort of true across his whole career. Protagoras gets represented in a more positive light than really any other sophist in any of the dialogues does. A lot of times sophists or sophists are represented as being dishonest, stupid, dull. Protagoras, however, is one of the more interesting interlocutors that Socrates has, both in terms of how able he is to meet Socrates in debate. So, as you saw in the Euthyphro can't really hang with Socrates. Socrates is doing his best to lead him around so that he gets to the right answers, or gets to any answers, really, not even the right answers. And Euthyphro can barely keep up when Socrates is sort of feeding him answers. Protagoras, however, is able to, at certain points, come up with counter-arguments to Socrates, forcing Socrates to take a different approach or a different tactic to establishing his points. That said, Protagoras is still represented as not so great. I'm not going to go into a lot of what Protagoras gets up to in this dialogue. Otherwise, I mean, you could spend like half a semester on this dialogue alone. Just going into the details of everything that happens. The really important philosophical stuff doesn't even start until halfway through. There's some important philosophical setup in like the first 20 pages, but the really important stuff happens towards the end. And part of that is because Protagoras likes to give big, long speeches, and he doesn't like to submit himself to questioning, and he has to kind of be bullied into doing it because he doesn't like to be proven wrong. Because his whole way of life is based around people thinking he's really smart, so he doesn't want Socrates to show him up. But Socrates and Protagoras show up, or rather, Socrates and Hippocrates show up. They want to talk to Protagoras. And Socrates, speaking for Hippocrates, who seems to be pretty shy, starts asking, Protagoras, what are you going to do for my friend here? My friend wants to pay you money for you to teach him things. What are you going to teach him? And Protagoras says really two separate things that he's going to teach him. One thing that Protagoras says he's going to teach him is basically, so I have a question here. What does Protagoras teach? This is sort of the first, the first topic of this dialogue. Socrates and Hippocrates talk about it on the way to go meet Protagoras. And then Socrates kind of bluntly, a little bit rudely, asks Protagoras this himself. And Protagoras mentions two things. He says, effectively, he's going to be able to teach you to become an effective politician. He doesn't use these terms, but this is essentially what he's saying he can do. He would be able to teach Hippocrates how to make great speeches, how to be an effective politician, how to sort of have his way in the assembly, things like that. He also will teach him to be a good person or a just person. He talks about justice and shame. So Protagoras will teach how to be an effective politician and how to be a just person, how to be a person worthy of admiration. Now, Protagoras does not make the point of treating these two things separately. But that they can be separated is a very important thing. And this is really sort of the subtext of the first third or so of the dialogue. And the subtext is this. Like I said in an earlier video, virtue just, or the Greek word arete, just meant excellence. It was a way to be excellent at something. And there's all sorts of ways you could have arete. You could be a fast runner. That was one kind of excellence. You could be beautiful. That's another kind of excellence. Protagoras himself brings up some of these non-moral ways of being excellent when he tries to point out a difference between the virtues, right, the virtues of character, and other ways of being excellent. He says, like, nobody blames you for being ugly or slow, right? But we blame you if you're unjust. We hold it against you. And Protagoras is going to have a theory about why that is, but the point is there's all sorts of ways to be excellent. Some of those ways of being excellent, there's no question about why you would want to be excellent in that way. If you could choose between being fast or slow, you'd pick fast, right? Especially if there were no cost to it. Like, all of us kind of face the choice about being fast or slow, or almost all of us do. Because for most of us, it's true that, if we work out every day, we'll get to be faster and faster and faster, right? If we watch what we eat and we hit the gym and we go on runs, we'll be fast. Now, for a lot of us, while being fast might be nice, it's not nice enough to justify all that, right? And that's a lot of time in the gym. Who's got that kind of time? So it's not the case that every kind of excellence is one you're going to actively pursue. But every kind of excellence is such that if you could just get it for free, you'd take it, right? If you had to choose between being beautiful in the eyes of other people or ugly in the eyes of other people, and there was no work you had to put into it, you'd pick beautiful. You'd pick fast. You'd pick strong, right? You'd pick funny. You'd rather be funny than not funny. There's all sorts of things that it's obvious that you would want to be. One of those things would be an effective politician, because really what an effective politician is a convincing speaker. Right? That's what was true in Socrates' time. Nowadays, to be an effective politician, you have to be kind of morally flexible and really not that attached to your principles, because it's all about, doing whatever you need to do to get them votes. But in Socrates' time, to be an effective politician meant you had to be able to convince people in the assembly. You had to be a convincing speaker. Right? You had to be charismatic. And of course, everybody would want to be that because it's so useful to you. It's obvious how being that way could help you get what you want. And so there's no real question about one of the things that Protagoras teaches: how to be an effective public speaker, right? How to be an effective political agent. There's no question that you'd want that. Even if you didn't want to get into politics, you'd still want that, right? If you just wanted to be straight in business and you didn't want to mess with politics, it would help to be a convincing speaker. But then what about this second thing? What about being a just person? It seems like these are two different kinds of excellences. And if you could have one without the other, you might just pick to be an effective politician or an effective speaker, a socially adept person. And you might choose to leave behind being a just person because, after all, it seems like being just, being fair to other people, right? Not hurting other people, not taking advantage of them. It seems like that's the kind of thing that doesn't help you get what you want. If anything, it gets in the way of what you want. Or at least that's a common sense way of thinking about it. So there's this idea that a lot of us have that there are certain ways of being good that are beneficial to you and certain ways that are not, because they're beneficial to other people. Right? So there's a distinction between self-regarding virtues and other regarding virtues. And this isn't just like the virtues of character are all other regarding, because at least two of the virtues of character, maybe three, seem like they're mostly self-regarding, right? Courage. How are you going to do anything great if you are scared all the time and give in to your fear all the time? Right? Being courageous seems like it's part of what's necessary to achieve great things. And why wouldn't you want to achieve great things? Temperance would be another example of a seemingly self-regarding virtue. Temperance does place limits on you doing what you want, right? So like you might want to right now, especially recording this, it's the 16th of September 2020, where 6 months into COVID and probably a year and a half from everything being cleared up, best case scenario. And a lot of people are just stir crazy, right? And they want to go out and they want to party. We've seen that because, when some states reopened bars, people immediately went and did stupid things, right? You might want to like go out dancing, get drunk, do all that stuff. And you could want that. And if you're temperate, you're not going to do it. You might think, see, temperate people are just killjoys. But actually what temperate people are is just smart, right? You know that right now, in the time of COVID, if you were to go to a bar full of other people, right? It's getting late September, so there's probably not a lot of air conditioning going on, but this was definitely true earlier in the summer. If you're in a room with 100 other people and the air conditioning's blasting, so the air is being circulated but contained within inside, like there's no open windows and stuff, all it takes is one person to have COVID in there, and there's not a great chance, but a decent chance you'll get it. And of course, it won't kill you, probably. Some young people do die. I mean, if you're older, it will have a good chance of killing you. If you're already sick in some way, it has a pretty good chance of killing you. But if you're not already sick and you're not old, it won't kill you. But like, that's not the standard we use for avoiding things, right? Like if you ask me if I want you to hit my knuckles with a hammer, and I'm like, no. You say, but it won't kill you. I'm like, that's true, but I still don't want you to do it because it'll hurt. COVID sucks. Everybody who gets it says like, this is not good. Even if you get over it, right? You got weeks and weeks of just terrible feeling where you feel terrible and stuff like that. Right? And some people don't ever quite get over it. They have chronic symptoms afterwards. So a smart person, a person who's not still just thinking of what works for them, what's good for them, will think to themselves, if I delay immediate gratification of my desires and I'm smart about it, I'll have more fun, more enjoyment in the long term, right? So you're going to take the L for the next, year and a half. But if you come through it healthy, you're going to be in a great position to have lots of fun once everybody's vaccinated and people just go crazy. Like once everybody's vaccinated and once we all realize each other are vaccinated, right? I imagine there's going to be some crazy parties, assuming the economy hasn't completely collapsed. So courage and temperance are self-regarding virtues. Right? So plausibly is wisdom. Remember, wisdom is one of the 5 virtues. Because like if you have to choose between being smart about stuff and being stupid about stuff, you'll want to be smart about stuff. Right? But there's at least one and maybe 2 virtues that are pretty clearly other regarding. And those are justice and piety. Remember that in the Euthyphro, piety is not just about what we owe to the gods. It's sort of originally about that and maybe primarily about that, but it's also about duties you have to family members, maybe even duties to the state. And justice, of course, is about how you should treat other people. Justice, more than any other virtue, pretty clearly involves you doing things that help other people. And so you might wonder, well, why should I want to be great at helping other people? Why shouldn't I just focus on getting the self-regarding virtues? And this is a problem, right? It's a problem for someone like Plato who wants to develop a reason for why you should be just, why you should treat other people well. Plato's solution to this is pretty interesting. Plato wants to argue for the thing that they talk about next, which is the unity of the virtues. The unity of the virtues is the view that all the virtues are different names for the same thing. So here's the answer for why you shouldn't just try to be courageous, temperate, and wise. Right? That's like the way a smart person approaches just helping themselves. Plato's going to say, or he has Socrates say, if you're not just and pious, you can't be courageous, temperate, and wise. Why? Because justice and courage are actually the same thing. When you think hard about what courage is, you're going to realize that it's the exact same thing that it's the exact same answer as you get when you think hard about what justice really is. So if the unity of the virtues is true, right, if that claim is true, then if you have the self-regarding virtues, you necessarily have the other regarding virtues. If you're good at looking out for yourself, you're going to be good at looking out for other people as well. This is the way Plato is going to argue, or this is the way Plato at this point is going to argue for the claim that you should be a good person to other people, that you should be just, because the only way for you to be good at helping yourself is to be good at helping others. There's no distinction here. Now, the unity of the virtues is not a term Socrates uses. It's a term that later scholars have used to describe his view. It's subtly different than a different view called sometimes the reciprocity of the virtues. The reciprocity of the virtues just says, if you have one virtue, you have them all. And the virtues we're talking about here are the virtues of character, right? Courage, temperance, wisdom, piety, justice. If you have one virtue, then you have them all. Now, at this point, the unity of the virtues and the reciprocity of the virtues all amount to the same thing, right? Or they amount to the same thing because it's still going to be true on the reciprocity of the virtues that if you want to be courageous, you're also going to have to be just. It's just that the reciprocity of the virtues doesn't commit you to the view that courage and justice are the exact same thing. Right? So the reciprocity of the virtues is consistent with the unity of the virtues. You can believe both of them. In fact, if you believe in the unity of the virtues, necessarily you have to believe in the reciprocity of the virtues, right? If they're all the same thing, well, then of course it's true that if you have one, you have the others, because if you have one, you have the thing that's the fundamental basis of all the others. But you could believe in the reciprocity of the virtues without believing in the unity of the virtues. And like I said, at this point of the dialogue, that doesn't matter too much because Protagoras, upon being asked about the relationship between the virtues, Protagoras denies both unity of the virtues and reciprocity of the virtues because he denies reciprocity of the virtues. He thinks you can have one virtue and not the others. In particular, Protagoras believes you can be courageous without having the other virtues here. He believes you can be courageous without being just. You can be courageous without being temperate. You can be courageous without being wise or pious. And there do seem to be a lot of examples of this in Greek mythology, right? Which is for them would have been Greek religion or even Greek history. They would have thought it. Take Achilles, for example. Was Achilles courageous? Absolutely, he was courageous. Was Achilles temperate and wise and just and pious? No. Right? Achilles allows himself to be overcome by anger when his cousin Patroclus gets killed by Hector. He then unwisely goes to, he then goes to fight Hector on his own. Now, he has, up until this point, not been involved in the war because of another time he got really angry when Agamemnon, the king of the Greeks, this is all part of the Trojan War of the Iliad by Homer, when Agamemnon, king of the Greeks, stole a slave from Achilles, Achilles said, like, well, screw this, I'm not going to take part in the war anymore. That was another case of intemperance. Right? When he gets to Hector, and they have their fight, and Achilles kills him, he then desecrates Hector's body, acting impiously, right? And unwisely, for now he's made a whole bunch of enemies he didn't need to make, right? And so Achilles would be an example of someone that Protagoras would probably say would have courage but not the other virtues. How could you deny he wasn't courageous? He charged into battle whenever necessary. And so, interestingly, Protagoras, who claims to teach both these things, right, how to be an effective politician and how to be a just person, is denying the view, which makes it the case that it's straightforward that you can teach both these things because they're both effectively the same thing. Right? Being an effective politician or effective speaker would probably be an example of wisdom in action. Right? How can you be wise? How can you claim to be teaching people to be wise and just? Well, if wisdom and justice are the same thing, you're set. So, strangely, Protagoras is denying the thing that would make it more straightforward that what he does for a living makes sense, and also justify his answer to one of the questions that gets the whole dialogue going, which is, can anyone teach the things that Protagoras aims to teach? Socrates expresses skepticism about that. He says, I don't think anybody can teach virtue the way you claim to. And he gives as an example that no one seems to recognize any expertise when it comes to virtue. Right? And as another example, rich or virtuous men tend to be unable to teach their sons to be virtuous. In the process of making this point, Socrates is clearly insulting people at the party because he says, like, look at that guy over there. He's Pericles' son. Pericles was virtuous, but that guy's not virtuous. Which is, an interesting thing. It gives you a little taste of why Socrates might have been a character who annoyed a lot of powerful people. So they have this disagreement about the unity of the virtues. And Protagoras gives a big speech where he tries to explain his position on, whether the virtues can be taught and things like that. I'm not actually going to get into that, even though there's a lot of interesting stuff there. I'm also not going to get into the long examination of that poem by Socrates, because again, while there's interesting stuff there, I want to get to the two big ideas that Plato has Socrates put forward, which are supposed to help him justify the claim that all the virtues are different names for the same thing. And that's hedonism and the denial of incontinence, or weakness of the will. I'll write it that way. Denial of weakness of the will. The next video will be a video just on hedonism. And then I'll have another video on the denial of the weakness of the will, and then probably a fourth video that sort of ties everything together.